The conquest is complete. The city's gates, once symbols of its pride, now stand shattered. The smoke of the final fires still climbs into a sky indifferent to the change of ownership below. The noise of battle has subsided, replaced by a chillingly efficient new sound, the methodical inventory of a people now classified as property. This is the moment after the victory, the moment where the machinery of the Mongol imperial project truly begins its work. Our focus is not the clash of armies on the steppe, but the systematic aftermath within the conquered walls. Our subject is the fate of the women, a fate not born of random brutality, but of a cold, institutional logic. To understand this fate, one must first discard the notion of chaos. The Mongols did not conquer through strength of arms alone. They conquered through a psychology of administered terror, a system where every outcome was calculated to serve a dual purpose, to break the will of future opponents and to fuel the engine of an expanding empire. The treatment of captive populations was not an oversight or a loss of discipline. It was policy. It was a deliberate tool. In the immediate hours following a siege's conclusion, a grim sorting would begin. The Tama, the garrison forces, and administrative overseers would implement protocols refined across countless conquests. Men of fighting age, particularly those who had resisted, were often killed. Artisans, scribes, and engineers were identified and segregated for deportation to the heartlands, their skills becoming imperial assets. Then came the sorting of the women and children. This was not a frenzied scramble, but a process observed, directed, and recorded. The primary institutional lens through which these women were viewed was that of the booty distribution system. They were spoils and resources, entered into ledgers alongside horses, bolts of silk, and ingots of metal. Their value was assessed along a brutal calculus: age, health, perceived social status, and specific skills. Noblewomen and daughters of rival leaders held a particular strategic value, not merely as servants, but as political tokens, human embodiments of a defeated lineage's subjugation. Their bodies became territory to be claimed, symbols to be displayed. The most direct avenue for this institutional absorption was the Ordo, the mobile Palestine of a Mongol prince or general. The acquisition of women for the Ordo was a standard practice, a means of rapidly building a household, establishing prestige, and producing offspring who would bind newly subjugated bloodlines to the imperial core. Entry into an Ordo was not a rescue from violence. It was a change in the nature of constraint. It meant a life of service within a rigid hierarchy, subject to the absolute authority of the Khan or noble. It was a life of invisible walls, where the vast steppe beyond the felt curtains was as unreachable as the moon. Alongside the Ordo was the engine of the military commissariat. Vast numbers of captives, men and women, were required to support the endless motion of the Mongol armies. Women were tasked with the colossal labor of maintaining the conqueror's world, processing mountains of looted food, tending to the herds of livestock that traveled with the army, tanning hides, repairing garments, and setting up and dismantling the endless sea of jurs at each new camp. This was labor on an industrial scale, performed under the watch of guards, driven by the unspoken alternative. It was a life measured in miles marched and tasks completed, where the individual was subsumed into the faceless logistics of empire. And then there was the market. The Silk Road, that ancient network of exchange, now pulsed with a new and grim commodity. Mongol conquests funneled a continuous supply of human captives into the slave markets of Central Asia, the Caucasus, and beyond. Women and children formed a significant portion of this traffic. They were transported over vast distances, their origins and identities stripped away, to be sold in the bustling bazaars of Samarkand, Bukhara, or Tabriz. Here, the institutional handoff occurred. The Mongol military apparatus, having extracted its primary value from these humans as tokens of victory and logistical assets, converted them into a final liquid asset, currency. The profits would fund further campaigns, purchase allegiance, or enrich individual commanders. This is the first layer of the horrific fate. It is not the fate of the dagger in the dark, but of the ledger and the lash. It is the fate of being processed, categorized, and assigned a function within a system that saw human beings as a renewable, transferable resource. The violence here is not in a single act of cruelty, but in the relentless, impersonal application of a system designed to dehumanize for the sake of efficiency and control. The true horror begins not with bloodshed, but with the cold, clear-eyed gaze of the quartermaster making his tally among the ruins. To be entered into the ledger was to begin a process of erasure. The system demanded not just obedience, but a fundamental rewriting of the self. The captive woman's past, Her name, her family, her city, her faith was an administrative inconvenience, a potential source of resistance that the machinery of empire was designed to grind away. The horror thus transitioned from the physical distribution of bodies to a more profound psychological dismantling, enacted through codified practices and controlled environments. The primary instrument of this erasure was forced mobility. Uprooted from the geography of their memory, the familiar alleyway, the local shrine, the view from a courtyard, they were thrust into the boundless, alien landscape of the steppe or marched along endless trade routes. This was a strategic dislocation. In a world where identity is rooted in place, to sever that connection is to induce a form of existential shock. The vast, rolling horizons, which symbolized freedom for the Mongols, represented an inescapable prison for those driven across them. There was no home to dream of returning to, because the very concept of a fixed home was systematically annihilated by the rhythm of the march and the temporary nature of the camp. The self began to blur against the monotonous backdrop of travel. Within the destination, be it the bustling Ordo, the remote garrison, or the merchant's house, a second layer of control was applied: linguistic and cultural isolation. A woman from a Sung city, a Khwaresmian town, or a Kievan Rus settlement would find herself surrounded by the guttural sounds of the Mongol tongue, customs that were foreign and rituals that were unintelligible. Communication was reduced to imperative commands. Her own language, the vessel of her thoughts, memories, and prayers, became useless, a private echo with no external resonance. This enforced silence was a powerful tool. It prevented collective grieving, the sharing of stories that could foster solidarity and preserve identity. It turned each captive into an island of isolated memory, with the tide of a new culture slowly washing those memories away. The institution of the Ordo perfected a more subtle form of control: hierarchical absorption. A new captive entered a pre-existing, rigidly stratified world of wives, concubines, and servants, all orbiting the central sun of the Khan or noble. Status was everything, and it was determined by a brutal calculus of favor, origin, and offspring. This environment did not require constant physical punishment. It fostered a perpetual, low-grade anxiety and competition. Survival and any semblance of improved circumstance depended on navigating invisible lines of loyalty, appeasing superiors, and avoiding the envy of peers. The mind, therefore, was reoriented. Energy was consumed not by remembrance of a lost past, but by the minute-by-minute management of position within the new micro-society. The original self was abandoned not through force, but through the exhausting necessity of adaptation. For those fed into the slave markets, the erasure was commodified and final. The market transaction was the ultimate administrative gesture. Upon sale, any remaining trace of her previous life, the name she was captured under, the region she came from, was typically discarded. The merchant gave her a new, generic name for cataloging and sale. Her story from the moment of purchase began anew. She was a product, her past irrelevant to her function as a domestic laborer, an attendant, or a concubine. The ledgers of the slave traders in Cairo, Damascus, or Venice would not record Maria of Kiev, daughter of a boyar. They would record Jaria, Circassian, age approx. 18, skilled with needle. The historical record itself conspired in the effacement. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of this system was its bureaucratic documentation. The Mongols were meticulous record keepers. The Jamchai, the imperial courier and intelligence network, and administrators used the Pesa, tablet of authority, to control movement and resources. While the specific ledgers detailing human spoils are largely lost, the practice is well attested. This means that the process of erasing individual identities was, paradoxically, recorded at an institutional level. A census would note 200 households of artisans and their women relocated from Samarkand to Karakoram. The unit is the household, the function is the skill. The woman, as an individual with a history, disappears into the aggregate data of imperial demography and resource management. Her suffering is rendered as statistics, her life transformed into a line item in the grand project of building a world empire. The horror is thus amplified by its own meticulous, dispassionate record-keeping. The physical aftermath of the Mongol conquests is written in the ruins of cities, in shifted trade routes, and in altered genetic maps. But the human aftermath, particularly for the captive women, resides in a different kind of archaeology, the archaeology of silence. When the systems of distribution, the markets, and the Ordos finally ceased to claim new victims, what remained was not a legacy of clear testimony, but a profound and echoing absence. Their fate was to be consumed by the machine of empire, and then to have the very evidence of their consumption erased from the historical narrative, leaving only faint, troubling echoes in the record. The first layer of this silence is source erasure. The Mongol Empire, in its later incarnations like the Ilkhanate or the Yuan dynasty, produced chronicles, court histories, and administrative documents. These sources speak of glory, of divine mandate, of administrative brilliance. They record the numbers of cities taken, the volume of tribute, the lineages of khans. They are virtually silent on the specific, systematic experiences of captive women. To record such details would be to introduce a note of vulnerability, of suffering, into the official narrative of inexorable, divinely sanctioned power. It would be an administrative and ideological inconsistency. Therefore, the institutional machinery that processed them also filtered them out of its own historical memory. They exist in these records only as implied functions, as part of a relocated population, as a cause for diplomatic complaint from rival powers, or as shadowy figures in genealogies. Where they do appear, it is often through the refracted, horrified lens of the conquered. Persian chroniclers like Juvini or Armenian historians like Karakos Ganzaketsi speak of the massacres, the pyramids of skulls, the rivers of destruction. Yet even here, the fate of the women is often relegated to a handful of generalized, agonized phrases. And the women and children were carried into captivity. Their women were distributed among the warriors. They led away the fair-faced ones into slavery. The chroniclers, almost exclusively men of elite, clerical backgrounds, lacked the framework, and perhaps the perceived mandate, to document the granular, daily reality of this institutionalized captivity. The experience was considered a private, unspeakable calamity within the larger public calamity of defeat. Thus, the silence was compounded. This created a generational silence. For a woman who survived, who bore children in captivity or in a distant market, what story could be passed down? To speak of the past was to relive the trauma of dislocation and violation. To speak of it to children born into the new reality, children who might identify with the culture of the conqueror or the master, was to risk alienation or to burden them with an inescapable legacy of shame, as defined by the social norms of the time. In many cases, survival necessitated a strategic forgetting, a conscious burial of the self that existed before the capture. The memory, therefore, died not with the individual, but with the decision not to voice it. Her history became a personal, unmarked grave, and yet the legacy is there, written in things not said. It is in the persistent diplomatic tensions, where the fate of captured noblewomen becomes a lingering point of bitterness between courts for decades. It is in the legal codes of successor states, where laws concerning slavery, the status of children born to captive mothers, and the rights of war captives are meticulously elaborated, precisely because the system that created the problem left a complex human residue. It is in the folk songs of the Caucasus, the laments of the Pontic steppe, or the epic poetry of Central Asia, where the figure of the woman stolen by the raider, or the bride from beyond the mountains, appears as a timeless, tragic archetype. This is where the historical truth retreats from the archive and takes refuge in the collective unconscious, in a melody of loss whose specific origins have been blurred by time. The ultimate, chilling legacy is one of normalization. The Mongol Empire's systematized approach to human spoils did not vanish with it. It entered the toolkit of empire. The methods of categorization, long-distance slave transportation, and the use of captive populations as a demographic and economic resource were observed, studied, and in some cases, emulated by later imperial powers. The horror of the individual was dissolved into the cold logic of statecraft, becoming a precedent in the long, dark history of mass human disposability. The captive women of the Mongol conquests thus became invisible pioneers in a vast, unmarked geography of suffering, their specific stories lost so that the blueprint of their processing could endure. There is no closure to be found here, no redemptive arc. There is only the echo of their absence in the historical record, a negative space that outlines the shape of the empire's true cost. The silence is not an empty one. It is a silence heavy with the weight of innumerable unwritten stories, a permanent testament to an institution whose final, successful act was to make its most vulnerable victims disappear twice, first into its ledgers, and then from its memory.